I mix what I like, what I like, what I like. What's up, world, and welcome to another edition of I Mix What I Like, imixwhatilike.org, or at I Mix What I Like for all your relevant social media. I'm Jared Ball. I had a chance today to talk with Iris Morales, who is a New York City filmmaker who came to documentary filmmaking after many years as a community activist, educator, and attorney. Her interest is both in history and contemporary social justice issues, especially the struggles and contributions of Latinos and Latinas in the United States. Her award-winning documentary, Pa'lante Siempre Pa'lante, The Young Lords, about Puerto Rican activism in the 1960s and 1970s, provides also the basis of the work that she is now here to talk with us about, her latest book, Through the Eyes of Rebel Women, The Young Lords, 1969 to 1976. I began by asking Iris to respond to a broad question I posed based on a section of her introduction in which she wrote that just as achieving some degree of class and race consciousness is a prerequisite to understanding class and racial oppressions, developing a feminist consciousness is also a precondition for both progressive women and men to comprehend women's sources of oppression, unequal treatment, and diminished presence in historical narratives. I also began by asking her to include in her response a reflection on the phrase she talks about in the book that she and her comrades had taken from Fidel Castro in a speech he gave in 1966, in which he described the role of women in the Cuban Revolution and women in the broader struggles for liberation around the world as being the revolution within the revolution. Here's that conversation with Iris Morales. Check it out. Enjoy.
So the revolution within the revolution is really at the heart of this book because so often the story of social movements are told through a male lens. And in the case of the 60s movement, so many of the protagonists are depicted as men. And one of the challenges in writing this book was really figuring out what is the woman's story. Because, many people said, write about the woman's story, reproductive justice. But I felt that our story is really the same story of our community. It's the same story of the men. It's the story of the men and the women, because we were not separatists. We were feminists within a male-centric organization. And so the revolution within the revolution was an apt phrase for us to discuss the intersectionality of our struggle, although at that time we did not use the word intersectionality. That developed later. And so Castro had spoken this phrase, used this phrase, the revolution within the revolution, to identify the important role of Cuban women in the Cuban revolutionary process. And so we adopted that. And of course, the Cuban Revolution was a great inspiration to the Young Lords and to all social movements globally. The internationalism of Fidel Castro was something that inspired all of us. And we did consider ourselves internationalists. If you read our 13-point program, it is one of the points of our program. And what that meant for us was that we saw ourselves in solidarity with all people that were similarly situated, with all people that faced oppression, whether it was in Africa or whether it was in Latin America or whether it was within the United States. So in writing the book, it took a while to figure out that I needed to tell the story of the Young Lords and then position the women within it, as opposed to saying, I'm going to tell a woman's story, because the woman's story, it was the community story. So, for example, I give an example in the early days of the Young Lords. And so much of our work was work that related to women. We weren't talking about, we're doing feminist work. We were talking about we're doing community work. The very first clothing drive or people's program that we did was to 150 welfare mothers. where we distributed shoes and coats and similar items. And so much of our work was work that related to women. And the story has been told from a male perspective, meaning that there are 3 or 4 men that get recognized, which is a disservice not only to women, but it's a disservice to the community, because these are people's movements. Change is not made by 2 or 3 men. Change is made by masses of people, men and women, coming together to bring justice. People seeking equality, people seeking liberation, and it's a continuum. It's always been that way.
So, just backing up just a little bit, when you're talking about the we who were in solidarity with various groups around the world, who were the we? Who are or were the Young Lords?
The Young Lords were a group of primarily Puerto Rican activists, but we were also, within the Young Lords, we also had African Americans, other Latinos, Mexicanos, Cubanos. We had people that were mixed, African American and Puerto Rican, people that were mixed, from different Latin American countries and Filipino backgrounds. We were people of color, primarily Puerto Rican, and what distinguished us was that we had two threads in our history, in our coming together, in that particular moment that the Young Lords sparked. We represented a new generation of activism in the United States, because Puerto Ricans had been coming to this country since the 1900s, and then were made American citizens in 1917. And then after 1917 came in greater numbers, and after World War II came in the greatest numbers, as part of what we call the Puerto Rican, the Great Migration of Puerto Ricans coming to this country, where 500,000 people came and settled primarily in the Northeast. At the same time, the African American migration is also coming to the North, and we meet in urban centers, and we inspire each other, and we learn from each other. We come from a history that is fighting against colonialism since the Spanish colonialists, and then with the U.S. taking over Puerto Rico in 1898 and setting up a military government. And took many, many years before Puerto Ricans, into the early 50s, could even have its own governor. And where we are, back to the junta today. So, the situation is dire. Right. So we had that history, but we also had the history of the struggles for freedom inside the United States, the struggles for justice inside the United States, and particularly the African American experience. So, for example, many of us, myself included, Malcolm X was my hero before I knew Puerto Rican history, because I'd been cut off from history. So those two strands come together. Malcolm X was a hero to us, to young Puerto Ricans being raised in this country. I was in high school when I first learned about Malcolm and when he passed on. And I cried. 3 months later, Don Pedro Albizu Campos, Puerto Rican liberation fighter, died after being in prison for the major part of his life and being subjected to radiation treatment. So we were inspired by the Black Panther Party, and we saw the leading role of African Americans in this country. And our position as Young Lords was really that you have to situate yourself among the most oppressed and disenfranchised of society. Right. And if you lift up, and as women, we took that to heart. If you lift up the most oppressed among us, we all benefit. And we have seen that in the history, in particular, of African Americans, of Native Americans, of all people of color, poor people in this country. You lift up the poorest among us, and we all benefit.
When you obviously the book being focused on women, the term feminism it comes up, and I'm wondering and still fascinated as I continue to read the book how you and your contributors uh, deploy that term. What does feminism mean to you, and how is it deployed in the context of the Young Lords?
Well, at the time, and I point out in the book that at the time we didn't use the term feminism. And of course, I do document a little bit, although I don't focus very much on the white feminist movement because we didn't really see ourselves as part of that movement. However, we did learn a lot from Black feminists and Chicana feminists at the time. And I think that we developed we were able to develop our position because Black feminists and Chicana feminists had fought fierce battles against the white feminist movement. I shouldn't say necessarily against, but had really had pointed out the contradictions of those movements and how those movements were not relevant, basically. Fran Beal, of course, and then the Chicanas in the Southwest developing their own movements. Within those movements, and I'm kind of going a long way with this, within those movements, there were also different ideas. And at a certain moment, those movements had to separate to make clear that women needed to have their issues or be recognized equally to men. That's why in the when we were interviewed in the Young Lords, the first article that interviewed in the New York Times interviewed four of us. We were basically teenagers or in our early 20s then, and they said, "So what do you do? You know, what do you do that in the Young Lords?" And I responded, "We do everything that the brothers do."
Right.
So, I mean, what else is there to say? And at another point, I think I also said, but actually we do a little more because we also have babies. Right? So, some of those kind of remarks were not always well received. But that is to say that we came in the Young Lords to our understanding of the equality of women through our experience, our lived experience. In that second chapter of the book, I talk about how when we were first in the Young Lords, and we were there from the beginning, the inclination was to treat us as mindless bodies. So, that one of the Central Committee members writes in a book that, he admits that we just said, like, these women need a good what, and that's their problem, So we had to battle very, very patriarchal ideas. And when alliances were being made with certain nationalist forces where the women were really subjugated to just cooking or, serving men, and we're not allowed to speak at meetings. And although those alliances didn't happen, we said, wait a second, this is this is an alert here. This is a warning that we better take hold of this. And we organized within the organization to make our voices heard. Now, we were not all in agreement. We all came from different experiences. And, some of the women we had a 14-year-old in our women's caucus. We had 16-year-olds. I would say we were primarily early 20s, but we had very young women and we had some older women. But at that time, I would say maybe the oldest was no more than 30. So we developed our feminism based on a lived experience, and we later began to learn some of the theory of feminism. Although we never called ourselves feminists.
Right.
Today, I do call myself a feminist. And I think it's important for us to identify with certain labels for whatever that means. I think that this is a moment like the 60s where a moment of definition where you said, I'm Black and I'm proud, I'm Puerto Rican and I'm proud. And I think we're in a similar moment today. I'm socialist and I'm proud. I'm Puerto Rican and I'm proud, and I'm a feminist and I'm proud. Right? And I'm an internationalist and I'm proud. You know, I think that we're in a moment where we have to really speak up. So,
you know, that actually adds. I really only had one more question, but you just raised, I think, another point that I'd like to quickly follow up on with you. You know, when you call yourself a socialist and an internationalist, tell us a little bit about what you mean by that. And I want to share with you just very quickly my part of my ulterior motive here. One of the biggest criticisms I had of the defense of Bernie Sanders' campaign, and admittedly I'm to the left, and I was at the time supporting the Green Party, but one of my biggest criticisms of it was that for all the talk, you know, people defending it were saying, well, when he brought up socialism or democratic socialism, it helped popularize the term. But I didn't think that he did a good enough job in defining what he meant by that, so that for all the conversation that might include a reference to democratic socialism or socialism, there wasn't a lot of what that meant. So could you share a little bit about what you mean when you say the term socialist and internationalist?
Socialism is very complicated. Right. I do agree that Bernie Sanders did at least make the word so that you could speak it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's important. I mean, I've been around for a long time and seen when you could speak words and when you couldn't speak words. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to be able to speak certain words. And so socialism is one of those words. To me, at a certain point in my development, I had a more ideologically grounded definition of socialism. Mm-hmm. I don't know if I have that same ideological grounding. And I know that when I need to speak to the public and to the audiences, I spend a lot of time with young people, with people of color, with, you know, more grassroots audiences, that I need to be able to explain what I mean by that. And what I mean is that the poorest among us should have access to everything: health, education, maybe guaranteed income, the ability to work in collectives, to produce the material needs of society, free health care, free education. I mean, in a society as rich as this, we don't need more billionaires. We have all of the resources for everybody to live a middle class or better lifestyle. We need to take care of our environment. We need to recognize that that is something that affects the entire planet, and that we may not be here to talk about all the other issues. So I'm not so sure if I could give you like the ideological explanation. Well, I could give you the explanation of ideological socialism, but I don't think I want to go there.
Yeah, I hear you.
I think that what I want to do is really bring people to understanding the concepts behind the word and what it could mean for our lives. Because one of, you know, right now, a lot of people are talking about what they're against. We don't want this with Trump. We don't want the immigration. We don't want, you know, the policing. We don't want. And yes, we have to say what we don't want, but just as important is, what do we want? What do we envision as society? Because we need to fight for something. And that's what I'm fighting for. When I say internationalists, one of the things that has happened, I think, in the last 30 years, and not that things were perfect in the 60s, but we had a sense of solidarity, of supporting each other's struggles. For example, we put the cause of the independence of Puerto Rico on the agenda for progressive people in this country to understand that that was an issue that was important to them. Standing Rock is an issue that's important to all of us. what's happening in any part of the world with poor people, Palestine. We spoke about Palestine and the importance of that issue to our struggle, or what was happening in Chile, or what was happening in Mexico. So one of the things that I think has happened among the many is that we've become so single issue oriented in our movements. And we need to really raise the interconnectedness of our struggle. Not to negate the particularity of our experiences, but to really raise the consciousness, because otherwise we get into what we say in Spanish, quítate tú pa ponerme yo, get you out of the way so I can be there. And that's not revolution.
Right.
And that's not change. That's just changing the faces. Since at that, when we were in the Young Lords, we were very little into electoral politics, for example. We did work with some progressive politicians, and we worked with the self-serving politicos that we needed to work with because you needed to do that. But that was not our focus. But over the course of the last few decades, a lot of people focus on this politician or that politician like they're the savior. And we've had so many politicians that are crooks, that have, that line their pockets. And so that we have to get back to the place where we recognize that that's one tactic, one tool, but it's not the totality. People talk about it as if it's the totality. It's, so anyway, I don't know.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you. And I really identify with your approach to describing or defining socialism and making it practical. I just wanted to have some conversation about it, because I don't often think enough goes with the passing reference to it. So I usually, and sometimes in my classrooms, I might say something like, well, wouldn't it be nice if all the money generated by the NFL or the NBA, instead of going to, 30 owners, went to the communities and gave everybody free health care and education and schools and housing and all of that. And it's, usually people are like, yeah, that's pretty good.
Exactly.
That's a pretty good start. So,
Yes.
So anyway, yeah.
I agree with you. I think it's important to put it in concrete terms for folks, because if we're organizing and at this moment, if we're going to be organizing, we have to really break it down so it makes sense to people. And a lot of the conversation about socialism often gets to theoretical or academic places. And it was one of the challenges in writing this book, because I said, I can write a very academic book. I said, but first of all, that's not me. But I said, well, who do I want to reach and why? And that became then, my guide. I said, I want to reach another generation. Palante siempre palante reached the generation after me. And I always credit that generation with making that documentary happen. Because even when I got tired and I said, who gives a damn about this history? It was a moment in time. They said, no, we want it. We need it. And they really encouraged me. They raised money for it. They advised me, the Rosa Clemente, El Galdo Miranda, that generation really made that documentary happen. And so similarly with this book, if I could just say this last point, I wanted to reach another generation. And so, for example, I recently screened Palante Siempre Palante at the Schomburg, which was a great honor to be at the Schomburg for more reasons than you know. And the place was full, and it was primarily late 20s, early 30s. I was so happy. They didn't know the history. And it was a couple of days after the election, and they came, they were dejected, they were defeated, they were despondent. But they left inspired and energized.
That's what's up, yeah.
And so that's what I wanted to do with this book. And so I wrote it in a certain kind of trying to be more accessible to folks, with a lot of footnotes, though.
Oh yeah, no question. And you cover yourself and do a very good job at achieving that goal. The one other piece I did want to ask you about, you sort of touched on here, that you have a section about race and colonialism, and you have a piece that you contribute to that in the colonial mind, rather, and you have a piece on racism and colonialism, and the colonial mentality, rather. And I wanted you to say a few words about that, if you would, because, one of the things that we did see, and I know Rosa Clemente brought this up herself, has brought that up a number of times, within Black Lives Matter, there's been a question of who is black that has re-raised some questions about where do Latinos or the Latinx community fit into that question, and then raising even within that community struggles around race, issues of afro-Latinx communities and involvement and inclusion. So as you talk about in your book, could you say a few words about that and maybe how you think your book might inform this generation in this moment around that particular set of issues?
The race issue is as critical as the sexism issue. Racism and sexism. Can you imagine a society that's a transformed society where there's racism and sexism? No, it's an impossibility. So for us as Puerto Ricans, the issue of race is pivotal, because for a long time, Puerto Ricans said there is no racism among Puerto Ricans. But there is racism among Puerto Ricans. What the young lords were able to do was a number of things. Well, we were part of a generation that was reclaiming its identity and saying, we're not accepting the official story that we're Spanish, whatever that meant. We're saying that our roots are in the indigenous and in Africa. Those are our roots. And we have Spanish. But it's not 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. As people try and make it like it's a formula, And there is racism in Puerto Rican society, even within the independence movement. And so we talked about being Afro-Boricua, Afro-Puerto Rican. Before this Afro-Latino stuff developed, I'm talking 40 years ago. And our first central committee was primarily Afro-Boricua, Afro-Cubano. And so we had to accept that. So we had to come to the understanding that I'm light-skinned, I have a certain privilege. And what does that mean then within the context of Puerto Rican society? We're mixed people, as complicated, just like the African-American experience, because, your sister may be darker, or your mother or your father, and we're mixed and we come from a similar experience, but the racism carries into our homes and carries, is a reflection of the society. But it's not only a reflection of the society, because we internalize it. So the issue of race is extremely important. So that piece generated a lot of discussion, because that's the third part of the book where I include some of the primary source documents, and it addresses racism within the Puerto Rican experience. And then the other piece that you allude to is the colonized mentality, talks about colonization and the internalization of colonial views of self. So they supplement each other, right? Because the racism within the Puerto Rican community continues in the experience here, even though it's a different kind of colonial experience, if you want to talk about it, within the United States. And it continues to the present day. And so I'm very happy to see that this movement continues and has been broadened. And it's, for us, there's no denying. As a matter of fact, when I made Palante, I always say to the audience, there are four things that I want you to see, not for me to tell you, but for you to see in this documentary. One, that we were an organization that represented poor people. Chacha Jimenez says, it's one of my favorite lines. He says, we're an organization of poor people and we're trying to let the people know what poor people want. That's one. Two, that we were an organization of young people. And young people all over the world in all historical periods have been the ones that have led social movements. And I don't tell you this, you see it. Three, that we are a Black people. And again, I'm not standing there or sitting there saying we're a Black people. You see it. And you see it in the book and the pictures that I have in that section. We're a Black people. Some of us are lighter and some of us are darker. We're a Black people, culturally as well as in terms of colorism. That's a whole other conversation. And of course, fourth, that women made powerful contributions to the Young Lords and to the social movements of those times.
Well, Iris Morales, thank you very much for joining us. Again, the book is called Through the Eyes of Rebel Women, The Young Lords, 1969 to 1976. It's been great to get the chance to meet and talk with you a little bit, and I look forward to continuing and finishing the book. And thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
And for all of you out there watching and checking this out, again, as always, we say peace to you, as Fred Hampton used to say, as long as you're willing to fight for it. So peace, and we'll catch you in the whirlwind. I mix what I like, what I like, what I like.